Well, welcome everybody to another installment of Joe and Josh Discuss Genesis. And we are picking up our conversation in Genesis chapter 46, verse 31. So
Yeah.
just to say where we are in the story so far, for those who it's been a little bit of time since you listened, Joseph has invited his family to Egypt. They've come. He's told them they're going to stay and they're expecting to stay, but they have not yet met Pharaoh personally. That's going to happen in the part that we discussed today. And we were just marveling last week a little bit on how welcome they are by Pharaoh. It's a good reception. And yet we know that at some point in the future, they're going to be put into slavery in Egypt. And how does the one turn into the other?
And then the realization that it seems apparent to me, if we were to pick up in 31, that Joseph is trying to prepare his family, even though he's been estranged from them for a period of time, and maybe there's been some obstacles of communication and difficulties, and maybe some emotional stress from actually just seeing them and such. But he seems to be wanting to prep them and prompt them before they go to Pharaoh, so that things will go a little smoother.
That's right. Yeah, there's a little orientation conversation here to make sure that everything goes as it should.
Right, right.
Like your first day of a new job, or maybe if you were to meet the president, somebody would give you the decorum, don't do this, this is what I'm going to say, and so on and so forth. So do you want to pick that up? Do you want to lead us out here in Genesis 46, beginning in verse 31?
Yes, I can do that. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who are in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men, are shepherds, for they will be keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our ancestors, in order that we may settle in the land of Goshen, because all shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians.
So they're going to have this conversation with Pharaoh, but maybe it's good to stop there. And we have been trying to figure out what the problem was for the Egyptians. And we looked up that word abomination that's used earlier in the text, and that seems to have something to do with ritual or cultic, some kind of religious offense. So we wondered if because they worship different gods or eat different food, if that's it. But Joseph sort of comes right out here and warns them
Yeah,
that it's their occupation
yeah,
that's the problem. And I think that's the same word that was used earlier, though, once again, and I don't quite understand this. I don't know if you were going to ask me this. I
oh
don't understand why a rarely used word in the same context is translated with synonyms instead of the same word so that an English reader can see it's the same word. The first time it was translated abomination, and now that word is translated abhorrent. I think that's one thing I disagree with. I think a consistent translation would make it easier for people to know that it's the same word. We do that sometimes, and I don't know if it's because in English we don't like repetition of words. I don't know if you've ever been tutored in writing, but I did my undergrad in English literature and did a creative writing emphasis as part of that degree. And there was a lot of pressure to make sure we're not repeating ourselves over and over again, that we use a lot of synonyms to make the language go smoother. I know that's an English thing to do, an English speaking thing to do, but it really can cause some problems here. So anyway, this word abhorrent is the same Hebrew word translated abomination earlier. And it seems to be the real problem is that they are shepherds. Now, I don't know how to do the research of Egypt at this time. I don't think it's even possible to uncover. We could only guess why shepherds were considered abhorrent. I mean, clearly the Egyptians had meat and they would have had people who cared for the animals.
Yeah, because the idea of shepherds is kind of and then it says keeper of livestock, and they say flocks and herds. So it's being more descriptive there in all, in all they have. We can talk about that in a second, but the idea that they were shepherds and they were abomination to the Egyptians, there's more to that. But I think before we said something about the types of gods that they worshipped in Egypt as well. But I think this in some ways is this sort of a distinction that they're trying to make about them being aliens or being almost it's like discrimination to some degree because of your occupation. It's
Yeah. So here's the thought that I'm having because I'm just thinking it now. So flocks and herds are two. It's hard to tell what's the difference between a flock and a herd. Like, what are they talking about there? It's two Hebrew words. The word for flock is zone, and that usually refers to small livestock. So usually sheep and goats or very small cattle. But the herds, that is bakar, and those are larger livestock, cattle, oxen, things of that sort. So
mm,
that's what they're bringing. And I had just said this, that the Egyptians worshipped bulls.
mm,
So it may be because the Israelites keep bulls, they're keeping cattle and oxen, these larger animals, as normal livestock. They're not treating them with any sacredness, and they're even butchering them and killing them, which that may be the cultic offense to the Egyptians. Because remember,
mm.
that word is cultic, it's religious.
Yeah.
So as I'm thinking it through, I have a feeling it has to do with how they treated those larger oxen,
Could
which
be.
were worshipped as gods by the Egyptians.
I think some of the oxen and such were used for farming as well.
Definitely.
So
Yeah.
so if
So,
they're
of course, they're coming into Egypt here with flocks and herds. I wonder if they were really farmers at this time. I don't know. There's not a lot of indication that Abraham did farming, but maybe he did.
they had to have the grain to feed them. That's what they went there for in the first place. So to plant the grain, they had to plow the fields and such. No.
Yeah, definitely. I just don't know if they were purchasing those things from the people of the land or if they were growing them themselves. I guess it's an unstated thing. We might assume they were growing some of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I would think they would have to be sustainable. The other thing is, I begin to wonder if Joseph is priming them because even though it doesn't sound like a lot of people, if 70 people were coming to a state or a church service or a town, you might prepare yourself in a way that's gonna make yourself look less threatening. There might have been a type of threat. I'm saying Joseph's trying to say, hey, watch the way you maneuver because you are not as accepted as you think you are in this land. Even though I'm in charge or I'm Pharaoh's right hand man, there's rules. He's setting the rules down.
Right, I agree. And just showing that they understand the culture and they don't want to offend them unnecessarily, that they're sort of bowing to the Egyptian scruples here, probably goes a long way to that humility you're talking about, that submissiveness.
But the other thing too is that there could be a temptation to make yourself look a little better than you are. I mean, there's still the ringing question in the back of Pharaoh's mind and all of Pharaoh's people. How did Joseph get here? If all of his family got, or
Right.
what exactly happened is a looming question that he's got this great family, but why? What are you doing here? Kind of
Yeah, I
thing.
agree that this sounds like he's in many more words, but he's more or less saying to them, come with your heads bowed,
Mm-hmm.
be submissive and humble and understand some of the truth. The Egyptians are going to despise your profession.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to approach them in a certain way to allow you to stay here.
Yeah, I'm not sure what else what they could actually say that's honest to Pharaoh. Other than this is what they do. But
So many things they could say to Pharaoh about themselves if you're introducing yourself and you want to be refugees in this land, which is pretty much what Israel is asking. They're asking to be legal immigrants
mhm,
who are coming to escape a famine, which makes them refugees.
mhm,
And how do you apply for immigrant status in any given nation? How can you be refugees? You think there are any number of things you might be able to say. Maybe it's money, maybe it's how can you contribute to the workforce? Are you going to be a drain on the economy, or can you help us in any way? And Joseph is insistent that they need to focus on their occupation.
right,
First, it will alienate them from the Egyptians, but it also may, if the Egyptians despise shepherds, they also may look like a nice workforce for them to do a
right,
job they don't much like doing.
right, yep, right,
But Joseph seems to know the geopolitics of this area, and he seems to be telling them, we're going to focus on our occupation. That's how we're going to introduce ourselves to Pharaoh, what we do for work.
right. I mean, you think about the times when Abraham went to Egypt, or the very fact that Abraham claimed the land and fought the battles for the kings, this kinds of thing.
Yeah,
So there must have been some type of reputation that could have been said, but Joseph saying, "Hey, don't focus on that stuff right now. We don't need a king in Egypt." You
right.
know,
And maybe this ties into the dating situation a little bit, but Abraham's time in Egypt would not been under this dynasty of pharaohs. It would have been under a previous dynasty. So this dynasty of pharaohs had no experience with the family of Abraham. We might remember, and you had said this the other week. You said, didn't God say to Abraham not to go back to Egypt? And I knew he hadn't said that to Abraham, but when I was doing some reading this week, he did say that to Isaac.
okay, yeah,
And so there was I don't know if there was a famine or pressure. We'd have to look back in Genesis, but Isaac apparently was considering going to Egypt, and God told him not to go to Egypt. And that's when he went to Abimelech.
mhm,
So Isaac was prevented, at least in that instance. Had Isaac gone to Egypt, it would have been under this dynasty of pharaohs, and they would have already been introduced to Joseph's family to some degree. But Abraham was under a different dynasty. So
mhm.
maybe that's, if we were to ask ourselves, I wonder if these Egyptians remember the whole fiasco with Abraham and the curses and all that. The answer to that would be probably not.
Yeah, right,
Yeah, probably not, because that's a different dynasty. So they come. Joseph goes to Pharaoh. He tells him exactly what he told his brothers and father he was going to say. My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds, that's the small cattle and large cattle,
mhm,
and all they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They're now in the land of Goshen. So they're already there. And from among his brothers, he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh.
yep.
Which 5?
The ones that were men,
Yeah. I wonder which of the 5.
and why it says it that way, huh?
Yeah.
The best looking fellas.
If I had to guess, and this is just a guess, I would guess it was Reuben, Levi, Simeon, Judah, and Benjamin,
Yeah,
the heads of the 2 households. That would be my guess.
not the insignificant.
Not the children of the concubines.
Okay, I have no way to argue against that, but
Well, it's just speculation. There's neither
yeah,
here nor there. But if I had to guess, I would guess that's the 5. And Pharaoh said to their brothers, so this is where we find out if they're good students of Joseph's orientation training.
right,
It's your occupation. And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, as our ancestors were. They said to Pharaoh, we've come to reside as aliens in the land, for there's no pasture for your servants' flocks, because the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now we ask you, let your servants settle in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know that there are capable men among them. Put them in charge of my livestock.
Right. Right.
But we might as
So,
well stop there and discuss this just a little bit. So maybe this confirms what we were suspecting, that maybe focusing on the occupation had the exact result Joseph hoped, which is that Pharaoh would see them as a benefit.
yeah, a benefit at rather than a threat, and may potentially improve his situation. They are 2 years into the famine, and if Joseph could do the work of getting the grain, maybe his family could do the miracle with the livestock.
Right.
Maybe that's the thought. But the five brothers, again, we talked the section about just a minute about that, and they do follow suit. They listen. They say what They give a good response. We come to reside as aliens in the land, though. Is that telling you something about the way they picture themselves, or how they're presenting themselves? We're not permanent.
Yeah. So the word there is gur, sojourner. This is probably the source of Hagar's name, the foreigner,
Foreigner, yeah.
but they're immigrants. That's what they're saying. They're not coming to be Egyptians. They're coming as foreigners living amongst them.
Are you thinking they're thinking this is permanent, though?
I know that they don't think it's permanent because they've been promised the land of Canaan, but I don't know how long they think they'll be there. That's a mystery to me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether they stayed as long as they did because they were made slaves, or if some of that stay was purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
All they need to stay for is 5 years during the length of the famine, and maybe a few years while the land recovers. But you
Mm-hmm.
would expect that they would be asking for temporary residency with the intent of returning after the current crisis was over. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, that that's what I would expect. And then the land of Goshen. I mean, the Pharaoh really brings it out and says it's settled in there. This is in the best part of the land. So he's reinforcing what he said before about that, and it almost some of it seems like we said. I think we said last week was or last time that it almost feels like Joseph tells his family that they're going to settle in Goshen, and then like it's his idea, and then Pharaoh says it's his idea, but I think there's been some adjusting and communication and such. But this is just really making it clear. This is the place, and
This is clearly not the best part of the land if you're an Egyptian, but if you're taking care of flocks and herds, it's the best part of the land for that. And I think that's what he means.
yeah, right, right, yeah. And if you have anybody that can do some good work, send them along to my area so that we can see some prosperous action.
And, when we deal with the Exodus later, which you and I won't, because obviously that's in the book of Exodus, but if you watch any of the movies and all that, it is said in Exodus that the Israelites are making bricks, right? Because one of the things that Pharaoh says is you can make your bricks without straw. It's one of
Mm-hmm.
the more famous early challenges to their desire to leave that Pharaoh gives them. So they're making bricks, and we're told that they build some of Pharaoh's store cities, cities that are called Pithom and Ramses. So that leads a lot of folks, at least movie makers, to the assumption that these guys are slaves in the sense that they're building buildings.
Mm-hmm.
That's mostly what they're doing. But that's really not the case, which we can tell when the Exodus actually occurs. They go out with a ton of flocks and herds, which means they're still shepherds.
Mm-hmm.
Their forced labor is mostly, I would guess, in terms of shepherding animals for the Egyptians,
Mm-hmm.
maybe working the fields for them too. So they do some building. Additionally, they do some building, but I wouldn't say that was primary. And you don't see that in the movie. So I thought it's probably worth saying. They came to Egypt as shepherds. They left Egypt as shepherds, which means that's probably the service they were providing there for the most part.
Hmm. Yeah, that would appear to be the case. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, and it, I don't really, I can't say that archaeologically. I know all the techniques and buildings that they built in Egypt, but I'm trying to understand what those bricks would have looked like. I mean, we talk about the Tower of Babel and how they use bricks and they use tar for mortar, which is foreign to us anyways. But we would never build anything like that today, like that. At least I don't think we would. Maybe some applications, but it'd be tough to do.
And there's been a lot of theories put forth as to how Egyptians built buildings, how the pyramids were built. The Israelites had nothing to do with the pyramids. That's a totally different time period. But some people have even hypothesized that they were using an early form of concrete. So there's
Mhm.
been a lot of theories, others that they were using cut stone. Certainly the earlier inhabitants of this, not where Egypt is, but not too far away in what's often called the Fertile Crescent in modern day Iraq and Iran, those nations were using these baked bricks
Mhm.
made from some sort of mud or clay. And that sounds a little like what the Israelites were being asked to do. And I'm sure there's a crossover in technology, but they're not being asked to work in stone,
Mhm.
even in the book of Exodus.
Yeah, it doesn't mention it. It talks about bricks without straw and
Right. And that
straw.
is a building, a type of building known in this part of the world.
Mhm.
So it's not surprising that would be what they're doing. But oftentimes, again, when you see the movies, they're using stone slabs and carving stone.
Yeah,
But that's not what Exodus says.
yeah, it's not exactly accurate, right?
Yeah. So Joseph brings in, we should probably pause here at verse 7 just to think about the first encounter between Jacob and Pharaoh.
Mhm.
Now, Abraham had an encounter with a Pharaoh of a different dynasty a long time before.
Mhm.
This is Jacob's first. Do you want to read this as starting in 47:7?
Yeah, sure. Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the years of your life?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The year of my earthly sojourn are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life. They do not compare with the years of the life of my ancestors during their long sojourn." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Joseph settled his father and brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had instructed. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents.
And I'll make a historical comment here. So they're in the land of Ramses. This has led that that and the fact that one of the store cities they later built is named Ramses might be a help in dating when Genesis and then later Exodus are reaching their conclusion. But this is probably named this later
Mm-hmm.
because the only real significant pharaoh named Ramses, at least one that you would name places after, is Ramses II. And he is, according to the biblical dates, centuries away
Mm-hmm.
from ruling in Egypt. Probably he's closest to the pharaoh called in the biblical text Shishak.
Mm-hmm.
That he may be Ramses II from a biblical date perspective. So anyway, just to say, this is probably the name of this location later when Genesis and Exodus are finding their final forms so that the people know where they're talking about. But I very much doubt that was named this at this time.
Mm-hmm. Good point. To help with clarification, I I wanted to compare the five brothers going to Pharaoh first, and then Jacob following to to the meeting of with Jacob and Esau, and I thought that was interesting that the men that Joseph picked were unnamed, and they were brought before Pharaoh. This doesn't say anything about their quality, who they are, or whatever. I tend to feel like they are the ones who are the shield for Jacob. So if Pharaoh's going to zap him, he can zap him right then. And Joseph is doing this kind of huddle as Jacob did with Rachel in the back of the line before Esau. That's something I thought was interesting here. Whether I'm reading into that or overlapping or putting a layer on here, just thought that might be interesting to note. And then it seems as though when Jacob is presented, that Jacob seems to feel like the wording makes it sound like he is the one who's in charge, or by saying that Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and is an interesting. The dialogue seems like there's um, Jacob has a sense of spiritual authority, or has a presence about him. I mean, Pharaoh's respectful, and he's respectful to Pharaoh. Those are, to say Jacob blessed him is a nice way of putting it. I mean, Pharaoh's doing a lot for his family.
Yeah, and I would say this is obviously written from the perspective of the Hebrew people.
Mm-hmm.
So from their perspective, Jacob's blessing Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt Pharaoh would have seen it the same if this was written from an Egyptian perspective. That's definitely the Hebrew perspective, but it's an important one for us because we know, even though the way the geopolitical entities of the day are set up, Pharaoh is far superior to Jacob. We
Mm-hmm.
know in God's economy, Jacob is far superior to Pharaoh,
Mm-hmm.
and he's presented that way as the superior one, blessing Pharaoh.
Yeah, and then you put that up against the phrase that the shepherds were abhorrent or an abomination to the Egyptians, and here you have Jacob blessing Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asking him personal questions like how long have you lived, how long have you been around, and what's going on. And
They're interesting questions. I wonder if they reveal something to us about the Egyptian values. How long have you lived? How old are you?
mm-hmm.
Does that seem just a natural question of curiosity? Or do you think it betrays anything about the Egyptians? It's just that Jacob looked so incredibly old, Pharaoh couldn't help but ask.
Yeah, well, the shepherds have a hard life. Their appearance could make you look pretty aged. This is not the same aging effect of a pharaoh.
I'm thinking about the fact that the Egyptians, throughout their history, their beliefs change over time. And so they don't have one monolithic belief system. I mean, the Egyptian, different kingdoms, they lasted for a long, long time. I mean, Egypt was, for millennia, was a dominant power in this part of the world. So they're not monolithic in their beliefs, but all of those groups of Egyptians who ruled, they all seem to have a fascination with the afterlife, made mummies and tried to preserve things. So living a long time seems important to the culture. And history tells us that most of the pharaohs don't live exceptionally long lives. Even the longest of them might reign for 70 years or something like that. But 130 would have been an exceptional age. And I wonder if Pharaoh asking that is a bit of curiosity as to how this might be managed.
Right, right. And then aging is not necessarily just what you look like, but your maturity level, what you've been through, what your experiences are. And so I tend to feel like, when somebody says, "How old are you?" Shouldn't you know better? And how come things haven't gone as well as you think? And you're coming here, and
Yeah. It could be
maybe.
that. It could be a type of judgment. But I think personally, I think there's a culture clash here because Jacob is almost ashamed of how young he is.
Yeah,
You get that sense he's thinking, my years have been few and hard, which accounts for the fact that I'm not attaining the great age of my my father and my grandfather. So he feels at 130 that he's young to be as sickly as he is. But I'm saying that I think, based on what history tells us, is that for the pharaohs, that would have been this must have been a culture clash for Jacob to say, I'm only 130. I would imagine Pharaoh thinking, only 130.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, but there is that idea. Pharaoh's like, what are your experiences are, and he talks about it as being a journey, though. Isn't it interesting that he says that they don't compare with the years of life of my ancestors during their long sojourn.
Yeah, so Jacob almost apologizes for his age, and we notice that he blessed Pharaoh in verse 7, and then he does it again in 10. So that's a repetition. It's important to the prophetic authors that he blessed him twice. I just want to observe this is a fulfillment, at least a small one, of the promise that God made to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
All nations will be blessed through you.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob has now had opportunity, because of a famine, to come and bless Pharaoh. Now that's not, remember, Abraham didn't bless Pharaoh. Abraham brought curses to Pharaoh. But Jacob does bless Pharaoh. So it's a minor fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham.
You think he does this reluctantly or as a fulfillment, like you're saying? I mean, is it like, yeah.
I don't know what his intentions are, but I think the prophetic tradition of Israel, by repeating it twice, is calling our attention to the fact that Jacob blessed Pharaoh, the ruler of one of the nations Abraham was supposed to bless.
Yeah.
So let's move on to this section that is very geopolitical, and this is where I'll fill in some of the dating details and everything. But let me read this part. So it says, now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes, for our money is gone? And Joseph answered, give me your livestock, and I'll give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, we cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are my lord's. There's nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, now that I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you. Sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and as food for yourselves and your household, and as food for your little ones. They said, you've saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So this is an interesting little aside to the rule and reign of Joseph. Now, he's doing everything on behalf of Pharaoh. So I don't think he could have exercised any of this without Pharaoh's approval. But Joseph is the person that the average Egyptian sees doing this. So Pharaoh is not engaging with the people and telling them to sell their land and to sell their flocks and their herds and to sell themselves into slavery. Even though I do believe Pharaoh is the one giving those orders, he's not the one they see or interact with. So I would imagine over time, this is not going to go well for the Israelites, especially since they're shepherds. And one of the things that Joseph purchases for Pharaoh are flocks and herds.
Mm-hmm.
And Pharaoh has told Joseph to feel free to put any of his able-bodied family in charge of those flocks and herds. So there's a lot of things going on here that might explain the slavery.
Right.
Especially the hate that the average Egyptian might have done all this because they had to survive, but it wouldn't be surprising if they resented it at the same time. Now, the question is, where are we in history? And I just wanted to give a little excerpt. This comes from the NIV Atlas of the Bible. The one I have is printed a while back in the 90s, and they've updated it since, but as far as I know, this section has not been changed. So it's hard to date all of this with any precision because it's not as though each chapter of Genesis begins with a date on our calendar, right? Our calendar doesn't come into effect until hundreds of years after Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of competing calendars. So we have to kind of put things together. So all I want to do is just read a little excerpt to help anyone who's listening understand how biblical scholars who take the biblical dates seriously date all these events. And then it might help us a little bit with what's going on in Egypt. So I'll just do this quickly. This says, it's generally agreed that Solomon began his reign in 970 BC, which means that his fourth year would have been 966 BC. Since this, according to the text, was 480 years after the Exodus must have taken place around 1446 BC. The biblical text indicates that the Exodus took place 430 years after Jacob and his family entered Egypt. And that is said in Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, which implies that this descent occurred about 1876 BC. From data given in Genesis, one can work back to the date of the birth of Abraham to be about 2166 BC and determine that the probable date of his entrance into Canaan was 2091 BC. So I'll leave it at that. So we're around 1876 when they're coming in, which means we're in the latter half of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. That kingdom is going to be overthrown about 790. So about 100 years from now. And we'll enter a period called the Intermediate Period in Egyptian history. That's probably the rise of the Pharaoh that knows not Joseph. Exodus and Genesis are traditionally written by Moses, which would be in the 1440s to 1400 BC. And he says that at that time, Pharaoh was still taking a fifth from the people. So apparently that little practice transcended dynasties. But the Pharaoh that knew not Joseph is probably the rise of the second intermediate period in Egypt. So I'm guessing that some of what happened here, even though it's 100 years before this dynasty finally falls, I'm sure this did not make Pharaoh or Joseph popular with Egyptians. And I would imagine, and I'm guessing here because this is lost to history, that part of the fall of this dynasty and the rise of the next, the Israelites were probably made scapegoats of a sort. And that's probably when their hard bondage began. And then there were several transitions. We talked about the Hyksos that came in and conquered Egypt. And then finally another Egyptian dynasty took over, under which the Israelite oppression got really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to the events of the Exodus. So for those who are interested in dates, there's a lot of geopolitical things going on here. But suffice it to say, the average Egyptian most likely came to resent Joseph because of these events. And the fact that they came to hate the Israelites so much that they enslaved them as they did probably relates to this. That would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
What are your responses to that? I know it's a lot of history. Thanks for giving me time to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there. The fact that it's in the text here, and the amount of detail that's offered, the idea that the food was being supplied to all that area, at least to the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, and because of the famine, he collected money. Joseph collected money from both Egypt and Canaan, so there were still people coming from that area, even though his whole family was already there and settled. And so I think, to say the least, the Egyptians would be upset, even those who were in that area in which you I think you were potentially alluding to come as the next dynasty, might have been some of those people who were upset with the fact that who has all the money, and then the livestock, and then essentially that's control. So I can see how that would be an issue with the people, but on the same token, we're seeing the fulfillment of Joseph's dream again being revealed here, even though it's I'm sure it was probably a bit overwhelming, and yet even for Joseph, and then probably it looked a lot like what we would call in our culture nepotism, where you're taking the opportunity and providing it for your own family or your own improvement, even though it was for Pharaoh. And so the fifth, that idea, the fifths could be looked like tax, but it's that bringing back that idea that it was a continued thing, an ongoing thing, that other dynasties or whatever would incorporate. I think they could see how this would be a principle to maintain control.
You could imagine how the average Egyptian, looking back, probably would have shared the story that life was better in Egypt before Joseph. And they
Right.
might have even blamed his influence over Pharaoh for making things harder, because Joseph rises during those 7 years of plenty, which I'm sure were a blessing. But it does look like, from the average Egyptian's perspective, that Joseph is really taking advantage of the years of famine.
Mhm.
Immigration in these days apparently is not that different than today. It's who you know, right? They're welcomed into Egypt because they're Joseph's family.
Mhm.
It's unlikely that other groups that might have wanted to stay in Egypt during this famine were as well received. And that can create resentment among the populace.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of things that Genesis reveals to us that helps to explain why Israel became to be mistreated in Egypt, and why the Egyptians held onto them for so long. Now, there's not a regime change for almost 100 years based on the way we do Egyptian history today. So the question is, why did the Israelites stay so long in Egypt? Were they waiting for God to tell them to go back? Or did they know they were supposed to be there for 450 years because of the prophecy made to Abraham? Or we could say that maybe at the end of the years of famine, they wanted to go back and the Egyptians enslaved them at that point. My thought is they knew by that time that they were to stay for over 400 years.
Mhm.
That's my guess. And I would guess that they were not forcibly enslaved for the first century they were there.
Mhm.
I think it's the regime change that does it.
Yeah.
And the fall of this dynasty of pharaohs under whom Joseph served that led to their enslavement. But I think they stayed most likely because of the prophecy made to Abraham.
Yeah. Yeah. And also that the vision or the communication that Jacob had with the Lord. It says, "Here I am," and the beginning of 46. I'm the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. I will make you a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt. And we talked about how that would be a song that they probably would sing and remember or recite at meals and stuff.
Right?
And so I think there was a vote of confidence. But after this next section, when Jacob seems to expire, it seems to me like that might have been harder to hold on to. Usually does when that stuff happens. But I'm intrigued also by the fact that that Joseph seems to see that they're getting bitter, or they could be getting bitter. They're desperate is the right word, and people in desperate situations do things that they feel they have to do. But Joseph gives them seed, and I think it's like showing some mercy or some relief in the midst of losing everything. I mean, they have lost everything. They sold themselves
Yeah,
into slavery.
right. Yeah, because what you mean is at first they're buying the seed, but when they run out of everything and Pharaoh pretty much owns them, their land, their flocks and herds, Joseph continues to give them seed. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, yeah, and to at least plant for themselves, and we're still in the 5 years of the famine. So I'm not sure how that's really going to work, if they're actually eating the seed or if they're trying to plant it, or the famine is not like so devastating that nothing will grow. I'm not sure about all that. I don't know how you could figure that out, but it's still, it seems like there's an element of mercy that Joseph's trying to offer, because they use those words. Here's it says in verse 24, at the end of the harvest, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, 4/5 shall be your own as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves, for your households, and for your little ones. It seems like he's trying to soften some of that blow of loss.
Yeah, and I would imagine, and I'm guessing here, that some of that giving them of seed every year and them requiring a fifth back is after the famine. But I don't know that for certain. But my impression is that this becomes a long-standing thing in Egypt. Like I said, about 100 years from now, this dynasty will fall. I don't know the details of its fall,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not surprising to me. The people become almost like serfs, what we would say in Europe, serfs. The king, Pharaoh, owns everything except the land belonging to the priests. And they just work as almost indentured servants on his land. And Joseph gives them the food and requires a certain amount to be given to Pharaoh, and they can keep the rest, to feed their families and to try and make a life. But this changes the whole geopolitics of Egypt, apparently. Apparently, it was not set up this way before
Mm-hmm.
the famine.
So it's kind of the idea of individual capitalism, or you're owning your own property, to more of a, you know I guess not total communism, but a sense of it's not yours anymore. You're working the land
Yeah,
for
it's like feudalism in
me.
in Europe in the past. It's something similar to that.
So it's a total upheaval of the culture.
Yeah, the whole culture and the way that the people interact with Pharaoh and his relationship to them is fundamentally changed. And I would imagine that some blame Joseph for that. Joseph is his advisor. It's Joseph who told him the famine was coming. So even if the ideas were Pharaoh's, I'm sure for the average person, they felt Joseph had a hand in it, especially since his family benefited from it.
Yeah, we see that in
So
the
you can
next
see the hate stewing, just like, hate and envy and fear stews in cultures, and often minorities get blamed for things going wrong. You can see that that's the seeds of that are right here
Yeah,
in Joseph's leadership over Egypt. And eventually it will result in the Israelites ceasing to be sojourners and becoming slaves.
right,
Yeah.
right,
And you can see why it historically that makes a lot of sense that would happen.
right.
So we have in verse 27, thus Israel settled in the land of Canaan in the region of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so
Mm-hmm.
he did not die right away.
Mm-hmm.
So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. When the time of Israel's death drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, If I found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal loyally and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my ancestors, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." He answered, "I will do as you've said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself on the head of his bed.
Yeah. So there's two pieces here that in this section I want to talk about. The first section is the disparity difference between the Egyptians and how the Israelites or Jacob's family, Joseph's family, prospered. It's such a parallel with the situation with Joseph himself being sold into slavery, was in Potiphar's house and was put in the pit in a sense of humbling himself. I'm talking about Jacob now, taking his whole family to this foreign country, pretty much to the pit and humbleness, and yet they're being raised to the occasion. They're doing well, while the rest of the people are doing.
The Egyptians are losing everything to Pharaoh, and the Israelites are multiplying greatly and gaining possessions. That is a recipe for disaster.
Right. So they're not 70 anymore, even after 17 years.
Yeah, they're growing exponentially, and that will become a problem for future Egyptian rulers as they try to do population control because the Israelites are so prolifically procreating.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see that in early chapters of Exodus.
Okay, and then the second section is 29. They use the word Israel.
Yes.
When the time Israel's death drew near, he called Joseph and said to him, "If you found favor with me, put your hand under my thigh and promise." It sounds a lot like Abraham with Eleazar. So there's a tradition here that I think we need to talk about some. The idea that Jacob or Israel says to Joseph, "If I found favor with you."
Well, and
And
Jacob knows, right? As many people who die know that however well respected they've been in life, once they die, the fate of their body is in the hands of their children. And some parents have very specific things they'd like done with their bodies, and they try to hand those instructions to their children, but there's no guarantee their children will do what they've asked.
mm-hmm.
And I've done a lot of funerals. I know you've done a lot of funerals as pastors. And the bickering in some families over exactly what mom and dad wanted
Mm-hmm.
is endless. In some families, every child has a different perception of what they believe mom and dad would have wanted.
Mm-hmm.
So Jacob here is being very assertive. He's coming to Joseph, not because Joseph is the head of Egypt, but because Joseph is the heir of the family. So the other brothers will have to do what Joseph says. Joseph is the heir.
Yeah.
So Jacob is telling the heir, if you have been pleased with me as your father, I would ask that you make this oath to me on what should be done with my body when I die.
Mm.
And Joseph is going to say yes. And Jacob does not want to be buried in Egypt.
Right. Do you think there's any moment that Jacob or Israel had any question of whether or not Joseph would do what he asked? Do you think he might be thinking about, yeah, my sons, they sold them into slavery. My son Joseph hasn't exactly had the best of life. You know, did I treat him the way he should be treated? You know, maybe those
So
are,
you're wondering why the insistence on an oath.
I think it's more along the lines of if you have found favor with me. Really, I'm really kind of massaging that because I'm wondering how Jacob may be feeling at the moment. I know as a father, you know, you make decisions, you try to do things, you want to do the best you can as a parent. You want, you know, guiding and sometimes giving them room and being outspoken and sometimes setting back, trying to let them make some decisions. And so I guess I'm really feeling what it might be like as a Jacob after looking back all the stuff that we've been through, the things that we've seen, the difficulties, how how he might be feeling in front of it. I feel like he's really vulnerable before Joseph, because he's saying to him, you know, I need you to carry on this tradition. I'm not sure of my other sons. I'm not definitely not confident that Reuben will do the right thing, because look at some of the responses he's had. Judah, you know, he's done some things that you know, not exactly proud of. Levi and such. So I'm saying he's depending. It's almost desperate. I feel it desperate kind of.
I wonder if he's so careful because he's afraid of maybe offending Joseph. You know, you could imagine a situation in our own time where maybe one of the children moves a parent in with them and makes them change states because they want to take care of them. Then the parent doesn't want to hurt their feelings and make them think they're not grateful. But they say, you know, I don't want to be buried here. I want to be buried back home.
Mm-hmm.
That can bring up a lot. Like, does he regret coming here? Is he disapproving of maybe my Egyptian wife and some of my Egyptian customs? Is there something wrong with being buried as an Egyptian would be buried? You know, it's a sensitive subject. I imagine there could be some hurt, and Jacob's being very careful to say that he wants to be buried in the cave of his fathers and he wants Joseph to promise him. I agree with you. There must have been some doubt for Jacob whether that would have been done if he didn't ask.
Right.
Maybe others had died in Egypt and they had been buried, and Jacob didn't want that to happen to him. I can imagine conversations today with parents not wanting to be cremated, but knowing that cremation is cheaper, and having this conversation with their kids, you know, I soft pedaling it so they don't offend them. But
Mm-hmm.
so I get that sense as you do, that
Mm-hmm.
Jacob is earnestly not wanting to be buried in Egypt, but being very careful how he asks. I'm not surprised he asked Joseph.
Right.
Joseph is his heir. I think that's the right one to ask.
Yeah, I kind of experienced some of this before, where you wonder if he thought that Joseph would be the only one that would really make this happen. And I think the oath that Judah made to Jacob is a strong one. I think it reveals a different type of character in him. So maybe there would have been maybe they all of them. I give them all the benefit of the doubt that they would want their father to be buried in the homeland among the ancestors. But I get the feeling that Israel's saying, or Jacob is saying to Joseph, I want you to do this.
Yeah.
And this is what I want. And the strong ritual, like I said, with Abraham, with the Eleazar, and with Isaac, this putting the hand underneath the thigh. I've read some people say that because of the promise of Abraham of the seed, his seed will be the nations. This idea that this ritual was inclined to be closer to that area without being specifically graphic. I don't think that it was anything inappropriate, like may have happened with Noah and his son, but I think this is a procedure in which there was an oath being taken between Jacob and Joseph. And so maybe you have some more thoughts about that. I don't think.
I've read what you've read, and there are some back when Abraham did that with Eliezer, and he was specifically sending him to find a wife for his son. There were some commentators that speculated that perhaps the location of this oath being so near to the genitals was because of the seriousness or family line,
Mm-hmm.
that Abraham was insisting Eliezer was actually taking his whole family line into his hands, and he expected him to be very careful. And so it was about that seriousness. I question that, though, in the fact that it comes back here and it's done again by Jacob. Now, it's possible that this was just a family way of making oaths, and Jacob didn't realize why Abraham did it this way, and he just repeated it. It's always
Mhm.
possible. Oftentimes, kids don't know why their parents do things, but they repeat the behavior anyway. But it also might indicate that this is a way of making vows in the land of Canaan, or maybe in the Sumerian Empire that Abraham came from that has been lost to history. Maybe
Mhm.
they did vows in this way. It should be clear they're not touching genitals, but they are placing their hand in a quite sensitive and vulnerable spot to make this oath.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if it's a cultural thing.
Yeah. And then on top of that too, Jacob struggled and was wounded in the hip. Whether there's an an idea that there's this is like a foreshadowing or a connection with the struggle in which the family is going to go through. There could be that passing on of that kind of legacy.
Yeah, and it is true that Jacob will be handing over the family line and the promise made to Abraham by God, the covenantal promises and all that. He is handing that over to Joseph. So this location of a vow and placing the hand in this position may always come into effect when the family legacy is at stake, when the family line
Mhm.
is at stake. Maybe, again, it's so hard to know. It doesn't happen that often
Mhm.
in the history of Israel, and this kind of a vow is never really explained, it's only described.
Right.
We're left to guess.
Yeah, the insistence upon being buried with his ancestors, I think, is important. Even though that is a different place than his wife Rachel, right?
Yeah, Rachel got buried in her own location. This seems to be, there's always some debate over where people are buried. Some, you might remember in the book of Acts when we talked through that some years ago, that Stephen recounts some of this history, and he has some of the family of Abraham buried in a different place than Genesis does.
Mhm.
So obviously there's some discrepancy in the tradition as to where they're buried. But I think as we've been reading the Hebrew text, which has influenced our translation of Genesis, Rachel's buried in a distinct location and everybody else is buried in the same.
Right. Yeah. The by the trees of memory, I believe it was, or Macdougal,
Right,
something like that.
right.
So he's insisting not to be buried in Egypt because he'll be a foreigner there. Is that what we agree on? And he's not going to be with his ancestors.
I don't know why Jacob is so insistent on not being buried in Egypt. I can't tell if it's obviously Egyptians practice mummification and a type of delay of the decay process that we know in modern Judaism is considered a violation of the law of Moses,
Mhm.
where you're not supposed to do anything to delay the deterioration of the body.
Mhm.
So, what we normally do today, morticians do in things where they remove the bodily fluids and they try to preserve the body so that it can be seen for viewing and it doesn't decay so quickly. Even today, Orthodox Jewish people do not engage in that practice
Mhm.
of delaying at all the decay of the body. But of course, this is before the law of Moses. Before that, those laws are ever put in place. So I don't know if maybe the family of Abraham always was opposed to the way the Egyptians did burials and so on.
Mhm.
Maybe it's just that Jacob wants to be buried near his family. This is also prior to the clear revelation of God that there is a resurrection of the dead. We
Mhm.
don't know if Jacob thought there might be. The Egyptians clearly believed in an afterlife, as did many of the cultures in this area.
Yeah.
Bodily resurrection in this world is somewhat unusual,
Mhm.
seems unique to the Israelites and among these cultures. But maybe Jacob believed in resurrection and wanted to be near to them, but that's unclear. We don't get, there's suspicions throughout the First Testament that perhaps resurrection is how some of the things God's promised are going to get accomplished.
Mhm.
So you see that in David and maybe even hinted at in Job,
Mhm.
but it's not clearly spelled out as a guarantee until Daniel,
Mhm.
really, just way later. So I don't know. oftentimes today, people want to be buried near their relatives, some for sentimental reasons,
Mhm.
uh, but some because they believe in the resurrection and they want to be resurrected together, thinking that they'll have to be resurrected from the spot they were buried, which is unclear if that has to happen.
Mhm.
So it's hard to say. Did he object? So my options, I threw a lot of balls in the air. Did he object to Egyptian burial practices? Maybe. Did he just want to be near his family when he died for sentimental reasons? Maybe. Did he suspect there might be a resurrection and he wanted to be near to them when they were raised? Maybe. Did he want, he had been gone a while. Did he want Joseph to make sure that that plot of land that Abraham had bought was still considered Abraham's possession? Was this another way of putting down another tent pole and saying, hey, this is ours. Remember, this is ours.
Yep.
Maybe it was a way of marking his territory and reminding the inhabitants of the land that some of this belongs to him. Maybe it was that. I don't know. Do any of those sound more likely to you than another?
Oh, then the fifth one, because I think you had four there. Fifth one is like the very fact that Israelite shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. Even the dead body of the leader of the family could be desecrated or treated badly. And then I think that with the concept of also what you're saying is that this is the reason why you're to go back, not just to bury my bones, but this is where you're supposed to be. Go
Don't
back.
forget.
Yeah, go back to where you came from, because that's where you're supposed to be. I think it's multifaceted. All those things are all options and are there could be's, but I think the strongest one is, don't leave me here.
When you have a family plot, for some people, it's more important than others. Joseph is going to make a very similar request of his brothers and of the family of Israel that his bones also be brought back to be laid in that same tomb. But it won't happen for Joseph until after the Exodus. They carry his bones out of Egypt when they are delivered from slavery. But Joseph is able to get Pharaoh to give him permission to do this shortly after Jacob dies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, he makes him swear to it though, and that means it's important. Some translations say he worshipped the Lord on the staff, and this translation says then Israel bowed himself on the head of his bed.
It's the word head, rosh, and then the Hebrew word is mitah, which means couch or bed, a place that you would lay down. So I think that's about as good a translation as you're going to get.
Yeah, some people say he worshiped the Lord as he leaned on his staff, which is, I think Hebrews brings that up, but I think other translations say it here too. Like,
Yeah, well, it might be a difference between the current Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew Bible, and other variants like the Septuagint and
yeah,
Aramaic translations, and others may say something different or might embellish, but obviously the New Revised Standard Version is sticking with the Masoretic text here.
yeah. It says in the footnote of the English Standard Version, it says Hebrew Septuagint, it says staff or bed. So it would be Israelite then bowed himself upon the head of his staff.
The point is here that Jacob enters a relaxed position, the vow having been made.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob is relieved.
Yeah, relieved that Joseph will take care of what he's looking for.
Yeah, these are hard conversations to have about what to do when you die and what to be done with your body. A lot of families delay these conversations till the absolute last minute, and some never have them.
Right,
So we can understand the difficulty Jacob has in bringing it up and the solemnity with which he has it.
right. He's not dead yet, because the next chapter says he greets the rest of the family, but and that's the blessing, right? Is that what that is? But
Right. Yeah, and we'll get to that in our next conversation because it's important and lengthy. All the things Jacob has to say to each of his sons, they end up being prophetic words for each of them.
mhm. But I like the way you close that with him being comforted. I didn't really think about it that way, and I think that's helpful because, in other words, a breath of fresh air. He's saying,
Right.
I know, Joseph, you'll do this because you said so and you swore, you made the oath. I like that because I could feel a lot of tension. I could see that might be there.
And I think we can identify with that. Like I said, if this was an easy conversation to have, then you and I would find in all the funerals that we did over all the years that everybody had it and
Mm,
everybody knew exactly what mom or dad wanted. And the truth is, I've done probably, and I'm just ballparking it, but I'll guess low. I've probably done 50 funerals.
mm,
And I think that's a low estimate because I can remember one year I did 14 in one year and I pastored for 20. So, but I wasn't doing funerals so much in the early part of that ministry because I was an associate.
mm,
So it was usually as a lead pastor that I did funerals with a few exceptions. But I would imagine most of those, if I had to guess, I'd say most of those at some point, differing children differed on what they thought mom or dad really wanted, which means the conversation was not clearly had. And
mm.
almost never did I have something written out by mom or dad, a formal covenant like this, where it was very clear what they wanted.
Yeah.
We probably need to wrap up our conversation here at this point. I don't know how you want to wrap it up, but we've talked about a lot of history. We've talked a lot about cultural faux pas and scruples and practices that we don't fully understand. The heart of this story is the mass immigration of a people from one land to another as refugees because of a famine, and how they get to that land, and maybe how some of the people who lived in that land felt about their arrival. And we know that this whole mass exodus out of Canaan, arrival as refugees in Egypt, is going to eventually lead to the Egyptian people enslaving them and oppressing them for centuries. So it's interesting just how contemporary this story is.
Mm,
In terms of things happening today, we're seeing a lot of people leaving one country and trying to go to another one because of famines and economic collapses and environmental disasters. And it's been so hard for the receiving country to accept them. And I think just like in the days of Joseph, there are probably more people turned away than are accepted. And in Joseph's case, it's because of who Joseph was that they were so warmly received. And I think many people have that experience, that it's who you know, whether you can escape these famines. How many people starved in the days of Joseph because they didn't know Joseph and they weren't related to him, and Egypt was not going to take them in as refugees? Very contemporary issues. And, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
mm. Yeah, I think more on a general note, the realization that our circumstances, what Joseph said to his brothers, I think is something that, especially in this portion of Genesis, really wants us to drive us back to. What you intended for evil or was bad, was God has used it for good. And I think this is an opportunity for us to see, when you talked about massive immigration, even it's huge even to this day. But as people of God, are people who are trying to learn from this text, it seems to me like God is saying these things are here to teach you what it's like, how to respond to your circumstance, how to realize that coming in pompous with your chest out saying you're somebody may not be the best approach. That it's important for us to realize who we are, and cling to that promise. I think that Jacob found from that vision, cling to that promise. He said, "I will be with you. I will go with you." It's a wonderful promise to recall when life is difficult or desperate or not really getting all the things aren't going the way you want them to. But you see that roller coaster ride now of what Joseph went through as something that Israel is dealing with. I mean, because God is blessing them in Egypt, where Egypt is decreasing, and it's like you see if the ultimate goal is for them to become a nation, and what is that nation for? That's what we kind of experience personally. I think is that we're getting difficulties, and if we just look at them as being difficult, we probably won't learn from them, and we just resent them, and those tensions are there. So I don't know. I think it would be very difficult. I don't know that I could do that. Could you do that very easily? Just go to another country and live there?
Well, I was just thinking about this. So you and I both live in the United States of America. And if there's any place that has experienced the years of plenty, America is one of those places. It's not to say that there's not poverty here, because there is. It's not to say that there aren't people who can't make a living here, because there are. But if you look at the gross national product, there's a whole lot of wealth in this country. And I think because of that, most of us who were born and raised here, we couldn't imagine leaving here for someplace else, because even if we find ourselves shut out or down on our luck, we still think that there's plenty here if we can just get a hold of it. I don't even think we can imagine what it would be like to live in a place where people absolutely know for a fact that if they don't go someplace else, they will starve.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not the world we've lived in. So I couldn't imagine having to immigrate because of where we are. Probably similar to the Egyptians in this story. The Egyptians couldn't imagine going anywhere else because all the food is stored in Egypt.
Right.
You know, this is where everybody else is coming. And they all suffered. They had to sell everything to get it, but it's here. So why would we go someplace else? The food is here.
Mm-hmm.
And as I think about that, I think about the fact that nations that are very blessed with wealth, even if they've got it through ill-gotten gains, and I think this story tells us the Egyptians did get some of this, at least Pharaoh got some of this power by ill-gotten gains. He took advantage of a desperate situation.
Mm-hmm.
But even those who did that, God expects that to be shared.
Mm-hmm.
And when the world is starving, he expects Egypt to help.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's why he sent Joseph to Egypt. That's why he advised them in advance to store up their wealth so that they could feed the areas around them. And I think sometimes in our day, we have forgotten that those who have been given massive amounts of wealth, it's not just for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe not even primarily for themselves. And Joseph realizes that all this food has been stored in Egypt to save non-Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he tells his brothers. Wouldn't it be something if nations like America or China or European nations thought, wow, we've been blessed to save people who are not our own? That would be something. And I think this story tells us that when God sends a surplus, he expects it to be shared. That's a lesson we could take personally and nationally.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that stands out to me is that when there's a famine, people go to where the food is.
Mm-hmm.
It happens in the Bible. The Israelites have to go to Egypt. Abraham went to Egypt before them. Abraham went to the region of Abimelech before that. In the story of Ruth, the family of Naomi had to go to Moab. When there is a famine, people have to go to where there's food. And it's not surprising when a nation is in distress that the people would leave and try to go where there's food. So the refugee situation in our world is not at all surprising.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what people have always done. So we shouldn't look badly on people for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Our own Christian story is full of people who did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that stands out to me is that in the law of Moses, God will remind the Israelites of their time in Egypt as the ground of some ethical things he's requiring of them. And he will say to them, do not mistreat the foreigner in your land, because remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember that when you went to Egypt as refugees, you were harshly treated and you were taken advantage of. So you are never to do that to the immigrants that come to your land. I wonder how applicable that is today in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. I wonder how relevant it was for Christians in America when we have had refugees and immigrants. So there's a principle here that Israel is to learn from their experience in Egypt, how never to treat a disenfranchised people in their midst.
Right. And then the concept of becoming a nation. I wonder if they would have grown exceedingly like they did where we read this. They gained possessions and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly if they stayed in Canaan. I don't think that would have been the case. And
prospered off of the resources of Egypt in this way. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, and that in the sense that they also became a nation where they were just a tribe before or a collection of a family group. They became a nation. So that
A nation within a nation, right? They became a nation of people still isolated because of the abhorrence that they were to the Egyptians, because they weren't Egyptian. They were kept in this isolated area. They were used for their labor and for their expertise as slave labor for the Egyptians, and they became a nation within a nation. And it's interesting, they didn't revolt or try to overthrow it. All they wanted to do under Moses was leave it, but they had become so essential to the economic prosperity of Egypt, and they had benefited so much from it themselves, that the Egyptians did not want to let them go. And that's what leads to the conflict under Moses. So it's just so interesting, isn't it? The dynamics and how similar that has been to ongoing history ever since this period, right up into our own day.
the crazy thing about it is that it wasn't even the Israelites or Jacob's family that made the distinction. It was the Egyptians that abhorred them.
Right.
So it was almost like because it might have been easy for them to intertwine with these people.
Yeah, intermarry and other things, which at this point where it was not prohibited by God, Joseph married an Egyptian woman, and others may have done the same. So it's not necessarily prohibited, but it's the Egyptians. The receiving country despised the immigrants
Right.
and wanted them to keep to themselves. That's why they're put in Goshen.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't go well over time. It goes well initially for the Israelites, but it doesn't go well over time.
But the distinction is still there, and I think that if that wasn't the case, it might have been a different outcome. Obviously,
It is interesting. Later, God will tell the Israelites to keep themselves distinct and separate, a separate people. That's really a lot of the law of Moses is designed to enculturate that into them.
mm-hmm.
But he doesn't say that here. When God sends Jacob, he doesn't say, keep yourselves separate, keep yourselves distinct. Don't intermarry with these people, have nothing to do with them. He doesn't say any of that to him. In fact, like you're noticing, it's the Egyptians that impose that isolation on the Israelites. It's not coming from the Israelites at this time.
Right, right. And
Though
that
we do know from the story of Abraham that Abraham did have some concerns about intermarrying with people in the land of Canaan that didn't share his worship of the God of Abraham. And he did send Eliezer, as we talked about earlier, back to his homeland. That might have carried along in their line. What I'm just observing is that God doesn't command it
mm-hmm.
of Jacob when he sends them into Egypt. It's the Egyptians that force the isolation on them. And we still see that today,
Yeah,
where a receiving country, when it has immigrants, there's some people welcome them, some people fear them, and they often are isolated.
And they also become a lot of times too the scapegoat that we talked about in the middle section, further down the
As the
road.
Israelites clearly became scapegoats for all the problems of Egypt, which led to them being enslaved, and that history has repeated itself over and over and over again.
Yeah, there's a lot of cultures, immigrants that experience a similar thing.
People who immigrate are greatly at risk. And the Israelite story tells us that's exactly the case,
Mhm.
that they're coming into hostile territory.
Yeah. And then the idea of immigrants coming in and prospering. Point is, we're trying to say, as reflecting our text, is that if you're in that position where you're desperate, you have to move into it. That it seems like it's well good in practice to be humble about who you are and how you process those things. Those things are hard to deal with in life.
You know, the geopolitical situation is so complicated. I would never give advice to anyone making policy, but it's amazing to me how the Bible deals with issues just like this.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very least, I would say that a lesson we need to take from this is the lesson the Israelites were told to take from it. And that is, if you have the power and the food, remember what it was like to be helpless, and do not take advantage of the foreigner in your midst.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a lesson that God took from their experience in Egypt and wrote right into the law and used it as a foundation for how they were to treat resident aliens. And the prophets condemn Israel for lots of things, for breaking Sabbaths and for not caring for the poor, but also for not remembering their history in Egypt and caring for the resident aliens as they should have.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the reasons they were destroyed, and we should never forget it.
Mm-hmm. Very powerful. Very powerful.
Well, thank you, Minister Joe. This was a hefty passage with a lot of history, and we might have gotten ourselves in trouble in some of the ways that we talked about it, but I think the Bible it becomes irrelevant if we refuse to apply it to our day.
That's right.
And so we have to wrestle to do that. And if anyone listening didn't like how we did it, well, we only start the conversation. We're humans and fallible, and we might interpret or apply incorrectly or inadequately. But it's for you to continue the work to know why God preserved this word for us and how we might understand it in the light of what Jesus has done and taught us, and then how we can apply it to our lives today.
That's certainly true. Yeah, that's what to work out your salvation with fear and trembling.
Yeah. Live it out humbly is another way to say that.
Yeah, walk humbly with your God. Yeah, there you go. It's good stuff. Yeah, thank you for this time. I've enjoyed it. It's probed a few things, and I think there'll be more to talk about. I'm sure.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your
Blessings.
week.
Yep. Take care.